The will had not even been fully read when the first accusation was made. Not whispered, not implied, spoken out loud in a room full of lawyers and grief by a man who believed with every bone in his body that the woman sitting across from him had just stolen everything his father had built. He was wrong, but he would not know that for a very long time. And the woman, calm, pale hands folded on her lap, would say nothing to correct him, because she had made a promise, and she intended to keep it, even if it cost her everything she had left. Richard Whitmore had spent 40 years building something remarkable. He had started with nothing, a small contracting business, a second-hand truck, and a stubbornness that his first wife once described as either his greatest strength or his most exhausting quality, depending on the day. By the time his children were old enough to understand what their father did for a living, he had already turned that stubbornness into a quietly thriving real estate development firm, the kind that did not appear in magazine profiles, but whose name appeared on enough commercial properties across the mid-Atlantic region to make people in certain rooms sit up straighter when they heard it. He was not flashy. He did not vacation on yachts. He drove a 12-year-old sedan that his assistant had begged him to replace for the better part of a decade. But the assets he had accumulated over those 40 years' properties, investment portfolios, trust accounts, partnerships in a dozen smaller ventures, were by any reasonable estimate worth several $1 million. His first wife, Sandra, died when their youngest child was 11. Richard grieved quietly and raised his 2 children as best he could with the help of good instincts and a housekeeper named Mrs. Patel, who stayed with the family until both children were out of college. He met Eleanor Voss at a charity dinner 9 years after Sandra's death. She was 52 at the time, widowed herself, daughter of a Virginia banking family, educated at Georgetown with a manner that struck most people as composed to the point of coolness. She was not the kind of woman who chased attention. She did not laugh loudly or fill silences with chatter. She listened. She observed. And when she spoke, it was usually worth hearing. Richard fell in love with her in the way that men in their late 60s sometimes fall in love slowly, then completely. They married 2 years after that dinner. It was a small ceremony. His children attended. They were polite. They were never warm. Daniel Whitmore was 42 years old the morning his father's will was read. He was broad-shouldered, prematurely gray at the temples, and carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who had spent most of his adult life trying to prove something to his father, to himself. It was never entirely clear which. He had built his own business, a commercial construction company that operated in the same mid-Atlantic corridor his father had pioneered, and for most of its existence the business had done reasonably well. He sat in the attorney's conference room with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, and his eyes fixed on Eleanor in a way that made the paralegal in the corner of the room feel deeply uncomfortable. Claire Whitmore, 38, sat beside him. She was a school counselor by profession and by temperament. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, but she wore both more softly than either of her parents ever had. She was not without anger that morning. She was, however, the only person in the room still listening when the attorney finished speaking. Michael Harper, who had been Richard Whitmore's attorney for 25 years, read the document with the measured steadiness of a man who had expected exactly this reaction and had decided in advance that he would not flinch from it. The will was clear. A significant portion of the family estate property's investment accounts, the primary trust, had been placed under Eleanor's control. Not transferred to her outright. Controlled by her. The distinction would matter enormously later. It meant almost nothing to Daniel in the moment. He stood up before Harper had finished. "You stole it," he said. "Whatever you told him, whatever you made him believe. You stole everything my father spent his life building." Eleanor did not move. She did not flinch. She looked at Daniel with an expression that was not cold, so much as extraordinarily still, the way a lake goes still before a storm. And she said, "If you knew what I know, you'd never ask for that money." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then tell us right now." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "If your father had wanted you to know the truth," she said, "he would have told you himself." She picked up her coat. She thanked Michael Harper. She walked out of the room. It was the last time any of them would be in the same space without lawyers present for nearly 4 months. in the weeks that followed, the story that circulated among family, friends, and distant relatives was the one Daniel told. He told it well, because he believed it entirely. A gold digger. A calculating woman who had married a grieving, aging man and spent a decade earning his trust only to rewrite his final wishes while he was too ill to think clearly. The will had been altered 6 months before Richard died. Daniel had confirmed this with Harper, who acknowledged the timeline, but offered nothing more. Eleanor had arranged private meetings with the attorney throughout that period. Several assets had been quietly transferred into protected trusts, and now, within weeks of the funeral, she was selling things. The vacation property in the Shenandoah Valley, a tract of unused commercial land in Northern Virginia, blocks of shares in 2 investment funds. To Daniel, each sale was further evidence. She was liquidating, converting everything she could into cash before anyone could stop her. He hired his own attorney. He demanded financial disclosures. He called distant cousins and old business associates of his father's, looking for anyone who had noticed something, anything, in those final years that might support a formal challenge to the will. Most people were sympathetic. A few were not. One of his father's oldest friends, a man named George Calloway, who had known Richard since they were both young contractors sharing a job site in the 1980s, told Daniel plainly that he was making a mistake. "Your father was nobody's fool," George said. "You know that better than anyone." Daniel said he knew it. Then he kept hiring attorneys. Claire did not hire anyone. She was not ready to forgive Eleanor or even to defend her. But something about Daniel's certainty made her uneasy in a way she could not immediately explain. She was a counselor. She had spent 15 years listening to people construct stories about their lives that were emotionally coherent, but factually incomplete. She recognized the pattern, even when she found it in her own family, even when she found it in herself. She began with her father's office. Richard had maintained a small personal office in the house where Claire and Daniel had grown up, a house that was now technically part of the estate, and therefore temporarily frozen. Harper had allowed family members supervised access to retrieve personal items. Claire used her visit to look at files. Most of what she found was what she expected. Correspondence, contracts, invoices going back to the 1990s. Her father's filing system was meticulous. She knew her way around it. She had helped him organize it once, years ago, during a summer break from college, which is why she noticed immediately when one file was missing. It was a thin manila folder that had sat in the third drawer of his central cabinet for as long as she could remember. She had never been allowed to look inside it. She had never tried. She only knew it existed because she had once asked her father what it was, and he had said without elaborating that it was something he needed to keep track of. The folder was gone. The files on either side of it were untouched. The absence was surgical, intentional. She asked the estate's supervising paralegal whether anything had been removed from the office prior to her visit. The paralegal checked the access log. One other person had entered the office in the preceding 2 weeks, Eleanor. That detail alone might have confirmed everything Daniel believed, but Claire had been trained professionally and personally to sit with discomfort before drawing conclusions. She made a note. She kept looking. What she found next came not from the office, but from a conversation with a woman named Patricia Ellison, who had been Richard's personal accountant for the last decade of his life. Patricia was not bound by attorney-client privilege. She was, however, loyal to Richard's memory in a way that made her careful about what she said. She confirmed that in the final 18 months of Richard's life, he had met repeatedly with a group of financial consultants, not estate planners, not tax advisors, risk specialists. The kind you hire, Patricia said carefully, when you're worried about exposure. Claire asked what kind of exposure. Patricia looked at the table for a moment. There was a careful quality to her silence, the silence of a woman who had signed confidentiality agreements and honored them for a decade, and was now deciding in real time how much of that discretion still served the man she had worked for. The kind of exposure. Patricia said finally that a good estate attorney builds walls around before anyone can get close enough to use it. She paused. She set her coffee cup down precisely. Your father was not a reckless man. You know that. When he started meeting with risk specialists instead of his usual advisors, I asked him just once, whether there was something he needed help with. He said the help he needed was the kind that could not be found on a balance sheet. She folded her hands. I did not ask again. Claire asked whether Patricia had any sense of what the exposure involved. Patricia said she thought it was better if Claire looked at the public records herself. She suggested a lot of information available about commercial construction debt filings in the Mid-Atlantic region, if you knew where to look. Claire knew where to look. She had, after all, spent years watching her brother build his business, attending his company dinners, hearing the optimistic quarterly updates, nodding along to plans that had always sounded more certain than the underlying numbers perhaps warranted. She had not asked hard questions. None of them had. It was not that kind of family. Richard asked hard questions of himself and of the world, but gave his children a remarkable amount of room to be wrong before he intervened. It was depending on the angle you viewed it from either his greatest gift to them or his most consequential mistake. What she found in the public records took her 3 days to piece together, and another week to fully accept. 6 years earlier, Daniel's company had hit a serious wall. The expansion he had launched to push into a new regional market had been built on projections that turned out to be optimistic by a substantial margin. When the market softened and 2 anchor contracts fell through within the same quarter, Daniel found himself facing a cash shortfall that he could not close through conventional lending. The banks that would have extended credit a year earlier were suddenly cautious. His reserves were insufficient. His payroll was at risk. He had made a decision under pressure, the kind of decision that seemed survivable in the moment and catastrophic in retrospect. He had used the Whitmore family name, not his father's direct assets, but a series of business relationships, long-standing vendor agreements, and reputational guarantees that were inextricably tied to Richard Whitmore's standing to secure emergency financing through a private lender. The arrangements were structured in a way that kept them technically at arm's length from Richard's personal estate. But that distance was narrower than Daniel understood. A web of corporate guarantees, cross-collateralized agreements, and partnership obligations connected his company's debt to the broader Whitmore business ecosystem in ways that a skilled creditor's attorney could almost certainly exploit. He had not told his father. He had intended to fix it before anyone found out. He had genuinely believed he would. Instead, the problem had compounded quietly for years. Interest accrued. A business partner he had trusted turned out to be skimming from shared contracts and then disappeared, leaving behind a legal mess that further entangled the finances. By the time Daniel was standing in the attorney's office accusing Eleanor of theft, he was carrying beneath his righteous fury a liability structure that could, if it became the subject of aggressive legal action following an estate transfer, draw the entire Whitmore family estate into a years-long legal battle and potentially freeze or diminish it significantly. He had not intended any of this. He had been trying in his own flawed and too proud way to protect the legacy his father had built by extending it. He had made mistakes. He had made them quietly. And then he had covered them quietly. And then he had prayed quietly that they would never matter. They mattered. And his father had known it. Richard Whitmore had discovered the full picture approximately 14 months before his death. He had not confronted Daniel. He had sat with the knowledge for several weeks alone, speaking to no one except Michael Harper and eventually Eleanor. What he felt during those weeks, the grief of it, the particular heartbreak of a father who loves his son and is watching that son's hidden mistakes become a landmine buried in everything he had built, was something he never put into words with anyone except his wife. Eleanor had found him one evening in his study, sitting with the financial reports spread across his desk, and an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not even sadness. Something more complicated. The look of a man who has realized at the end of his life that protecting his family is going to require him to make a decision that will almost certainly be misunderstood. She sat down across from him. She waited. He told her everything. The debt structure, the legal exposure, the risk that if the estate transferred, normally distributed among the children as they all expected, it would become immediately vulnerable to the creditors circling Daniel's company. Properties could be frozen. Trust accounts could be challenged. Litigation could drag on for years, diminishing the estate, with every filing, every delay, every attorney's fee. What Richard had spent 40 years building could be unraveled, not by greed or malice, but by a cascade of legal consequences that nobody would be able to stop once it started. He had a plan. It was complex. It required placing the estate's primary assets into protective trusts with carefully structured access restrictions. It required maintaining control during the legal vulnerability period rather than distributing freely. It required someone at the center of it who understood the full picture, had the financial sophistication to manage it, and had no personal legal exposure that could be exploited. He looked at Eleanor. "The problem," he said, "is that whoever controls it will look guilty." Eleanor understood immediately. She had grown up in a banking family. She had spent her adult life watching how money moved through wealthy families and how those movements were perceived and how rarely perception matched reality. She knew what it would look like. She knew what Daniel would say. She knew what the family's friends would assume and what the rumors would sound like and how many people would believe them. She asked Richard one question. "Is there any way to protect them that doesn't require this?" He said he and Harper had looked for months. There was not. She asked for a day to think. She came back the next morning and said yes. She did not say it easily. She had spent the night sitting in the chair by her bedroom window, going through the implications the way she had been trained, growing up to go through any complicated financial structure from every angle, at every stage, looking for the thing you have missed that will matter most later. She did not find a better option. She found only variations on the same choice: carry this, or lose everything. She chose to carry it. What followed was a period that Eleanor would later describe in the only private journal entry she ever wrote about it as the loneliest of her life. She attended family dinners with the knowledge sitting inside her like a stone. She watched Daniel speak confidently about the company's prospects and said nothing. She watched Claire laugh at something her father said and felt the weight of knowing that the laughter would stop, that grief was coming, that after the grief would come accusation, and that she would have to absorb the accusation in silence. Richard deteriorated faster than either of them had hoped. The protective legal structures he and Harper had designed were in place, but they were not yet fully settled when he died. Eleanor was left to manage the aftermath alone: the estate, the trusts, the careful liquidation of certain leveraged assets before they became liabilities, the ongoing legal maintenance that the protection plan required. She began paying those legal costs herself. It was not something Richard had asked her to do. It was something she decided. The estate had sufficient resources, but drawing on them too early or too visibly could complicate the protective structure. She had her own inheritance from her first husband's estate, substantial if not vast, and she began rooting it quietly into the legal and financial work required to keep the Whitmore estate intact. She sold the Shenandoah property because it carried a debt obligation that was too exposed. She sold the commercial land because it was tied to one of Daniel's company's guarantee chains. She liquidated the investment shares because they were in a fund with a creditor-friendly disclosure structure that Harper had flagged as a vulnerability. Every sale looked from the outside like a woman cashing in her husband's legacy. Every sale was, in fact, a woman shoring up the walls of the house her husband had built and asked her to protect. Claire found the first thread of this truth through Patricia Ellison. She pulled the second thread herself, spending evenings in her apartment, going through public financial filings, with the focused patience of someone who has learned to look for what isn't there as much as what is. She found a filing reference that connected a Whitmore-affiliated partnership to one of Daniel's company's guarantee arrangements. She found the corresponding legal response, a protective trust structure filed 14 months ago that had quietly closed off the exposure. She found 3 subsequent filings that maintained the closure. All 3 had been initiated by Eleanor's attorney. All 3 had been paid for according to one document she found through a property escrow record by Eleanor personally. She sat with that information for a long time before she called Michael Harper. Harper met her at his office on a Tuesday morning. He was a precise, silver-haired man in his late 60s, who had the careful manner of someone who has kept a great many confidences and takes the responsibility seriously. He could not tell her everything. He told her enough. "Your father knew exactly what he was doing," he said. "And so did Eleanor." Claire asked how long Eleanor had known. "From the beginning," Harper said. "She knew what it would cost her. She agreed anyway." Claire drove home in silence. She sat in her car in her parking garage for 20 minutes. She was thinking about her father, about the specific quality of his love, which had always been more practical than demonstrative, more protective than effusive, and how she had sometimes wished growing up that he would simply say the thing instead of arranging it quietly, so that it was already done before anyone noticed. He had done it again. The sealed letter had been in Harper's possession for 14 months. Richard's instructions had been specific. The letter was not to be opened at the reading of the will. It was not to be disclosed unless and until the legal challenge to the estate reached a formal proceeding, the point at which the conflict had gone as far as it could go without a judge. Daniel had, by the 5th month after the funeral, filed a formal contest. The proceeding was scheduled. The family gathered in a conference room that was significantly less comfortable than the one where they had heard the will. There were attorneys on both sides. There was a mediator. There was Eleanor sitting with her hands folded in a posture that had not changed in months, and Daniel, who still believed with considerable conviction that he was about to win. Harper entered with an envelope. He explained its provenance. He noted Richard's instructions. He opened it and read aloud. Richard's voice, recognizable to both of his children, even in the formal language of a written document, and the cadence and the plainness of the words he chose, filled the room. He explained what he had discovered. He explained the risk. He explained with characteristic brevity and without sentimentality that he had spent weeks looking for another way and had not found one. Then he wrote about Eleanor. He wrote that she had not wanted this. He wrote that she had asked whether there was any alternative and had only accepted when he confirmed there was not. He wrote that in 25 years of business and in 40 years of life as an adult who had made consequential decisions, he had rarely seen anyone agree to carry a burden of this particular kind, the burden of being misunderstood without recourse for an indefinite period with such quiet and complete willingness. He wrote, "The easiest thing Eleanor could have done was walk away. She could have refused. She could have divorced me. She could have taken the inheritance she was legally entitled to and let the rest of it burn. She chose instead to stay and to be blamed and to protect all of you from a consequence that none of you knew was coming and that at least one of you helped create. The only person I trusted to let everyone hate her for the sake of this family was my wife. I want you to understand what that means. I want you to understand what it cost her. And I want you to understand that every dollar currently in the trust is there because she spent her own money making sure it stayed." The room was quiet for a long moment. Nobody moved. The mediator, who had expected procedural argument and had prepared for procedural argument, sat with her pen suspended above her notepad and said nothing. One of Daniel's attorneys looked at his hands. The paralegal near the door, who was 26 years old and had been working in estate law for less than 3 years, would tell a colleague the following week that she had never seen a room change the way that room changed, that it had felt, she said, like watching a building's entire internal structure shift without the outside walls moving at all. Then Daniel made a sound that was not quite a word, and was not quite silence, something in between, and he put both hands flat on the table, and he stared at the space in front of him with the expression of a man who has just watched the entire architecture of his understanding collapse from the inside. Claire was already crying, not loudly, the way she had cried at her father's funeral, quietly looking straight ahead, as though grief were something you did with your full attention. Eleanor sat very still. Then, for the first time in months, her composure cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. Her chin dropped. Her eyes closed. 2 tears ran down her face, and she did not wipe them away. The legal proceedings concluded within 6 weeks of the letter being read. Daniel withdrew the contest. His own attorneys, once they understood the full picture of his company's legal exposure, advised him in the strongest possible terms that continued litigation would expose him to discovery processes he could not afford to survive. He agreed. He signed the paperwork in Harper's office on a Thursday afternoon alone, without telling anyone in advance. The protective trust structure remained in place for another 18 months as Eleanor and Harper worked through the remaining legal threads. During that period, Eleanor continued to manage the estate with the same quiet precision she had applied from the beginning. She did not make dramatic gestures. She did not seek recognition. She attended to the work and let the work speak. By the time the trust was finally settled and the assets were properly distributed to the heirs, more than 2 years after Richard's death, the total value of the estate was modestly higher than it had been the day he died. The legal protections had held. The creditor exposure had been neutralized. Daniel's company was still operating, still employing the people who depended on it, still bearing the Whitmore name in a region where that name still meant something. None of that would have been true without Eleanor. Daniel went to see her on a Tuesday in late October, more than 2 years after the morning he had stood in that conference room and accused her of theft. He had told no one he was going. He drove himself. He sat in the driveway of her house for a few minutes before getting out of the car, not because he was afraid of her, but because he was still assembling the words, and he was not someone who spoke. Before he was ready, she answered the door before he knocked. She had seen the car from the window. She let him in. She made coffee. They sat at a small table in the kitchen in a silence that was not comfortable, but was, at least, honest. He said, "I spent years believing you took everything." She said, "I know." He said, "And you never defended yourself." She said, "Your father asked me not to. He thought that if I explained, the explanation would lead to questions you would answer badly, and that would make everything worse." He was quiet for a moment. "He was right," Daniel said. "I would have made everything worse." He looked at his coffee cup. Then he looked at Eleanor. There was something in his face that had not been there in all the times she had seen him since Richard's death. A specific kind of grief that belongs to people who have finally located the true source of a pain they have been misattributing for years. "He loved you," Daniel said. "I knew that. I never let myself believe it mattered." Eleanor did not say anything. "Thank you," Daniel said, "for staying, for not telling me, for protecting something I would have destroyed if I'd known you were protecting it." He did not say he was sorry. She did not ask him to. He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the table between them. A key. Old brass attached to a worn leather tag with a property number written on it, in his father's handwriting. It was the key to the family's original home, the house where he and Claire had grown up, the one that was now finally properly transferred to its rightful heirs. "Dad always said this house was the place he built everything else to protect," Daniel said. "I think he'd want you to have the key." Eleanor looked at it for a moment. She picked it up, held it in both hands. Then she cried, in the way she had not cried in 2 years. Fully quietly, the grief and the relief coming together in the way they only can when the thing you have been carrying for a very long time is finally gently set down. The following spring, on what would have been Richard's 73rd birthday, the family gathered at the original house for the first time, without lawyers, without agendas, without the taught performed civility of people conducting a legal dispute in the presence of witnesses. It was a small gathering. Daniel and his wife, Claire and her partner, 3 grandchildren who were too young to understand what had happened and were mostly interested in the yard. Eleanor, who arrived last and was greeted at the door by Claire, who hugged her in the straightforward way of someone who has decided that the complicated feelings and the simple gesture can coexist. They ate. They looked at old photographs. Daniel showed his kids the workshop in the back where his father had taught him to measure a cut twice and make it once. Claire found a box of birthday cards she had made as a child and read them aloud to general laughter. Eleanor sat on the back porch in the late afternoon sun with a cup of tea and watched the grandchildren run in circles in the grass and thought about Richard, about the way he had looked at her across his study on the night he had told her everything and asked without asking and trusted her with the most important thing he had left to give. She had not asked to be trusted with it. She had not wanted to be the person who carried it. But she had understood in the way that people sometimes understand the things they would rather not, that the only alternative was to let something irreplaceable be lost. So she had stayed. She had let them believe what they believed. She had done the work quietly and visibly, in the way that love sometimes works when it has no audience, and no reward, and only the unadorned intention of keeping something whole. There is a particular kind of person the world rarely recognizes, until long after they have done what needed to be done. Not because they seek recognition, but because they do not need it. Because the thing they are protecting matters more than any acknowledgement they might receive for protecting it. Because they have made peace somewhere in the private interior of their lives with the gap between what they have done and what they will be credited for. Eleanor Whitmore was that kind of person. She had not been asked to be heroic. She had been asked to be quiet and steady and willing to absorb what others could not carry. She had done so without drama and without surrender, and without ever once asking for the story to come out differently. Richard had known she would. That was why he had asked her, not because she was the only person capable, but because she was the only person he trusted to do it without losing herself in the process. To hold the burden without becoming the burden. To protect his family without needing his family to understand that she was doing it. The inheritance his children ultimately received was larger and safer and cleaner than it would have been without her. But that was not the most important thing he left them. The most important thing was the understanding, slow and coming painful to arrive at, but real when it finally got there, that the people who love us most are not always the people who say so loudly. Sometimes they are the ones who say nothing, who stay when staying is hard, who take on the burden of being misunderstood so that the people they love can be spared something worse. The greatest inheritance isn't always written in a document. Sometimes it lives in the quiet, unremarked decisions of someone who chose when everything in the situation made it easier to walk away to stay.